Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 7th Vidhi Book Adda. For those of you who know the Vidhi Center for Policy, our book addas are a little different from the usual research-oriented discussions that we organize. For us, they're a welcome chance to let someone else take the lead and do most of the talking. And of course, it's an opportunity for us to learn about worlds that are probably a little more fascinating than the law and policy research that we do on a regular basis. So today's book, which we're going to be discussing with the author, Professor Joseph Sassoon, is titled The Global Merchants. And it promises to take us across many worlds, actually around the world, in fact, right from Baghdad to Bombay, from London to Shanghai, and even to the Bahamas, as it traces the fortunes of the Sassoon dynasty over a period of 180 years or so. We're very grateful to have a member of the Sassoon family guiding us through this discussion. So Professor Joseph Sassoon is, apart from being the director of the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University, is also the great-great-grandson of the brother of the founding patriarch of the Sassoon family, David Sassoon. So he's spent an enormous, there's an enormous amount of effort that's gone into producing the wonderful detail that this book contains. And we're very lucky to be able to have him here with us today to take us through it. So thank you very much, Professor Sassoon. We also have in conversation with us Professor Faisal Devji, who teaches Indian history at Oxford and is director of the Asian Studies Center at St. Anthony's College there. And Faisal will have lots to tell us about the political and economic climate in which the Sassoons flourished, especially in Bombay. And we're very glad that you could be here with us to have this discussion today, Faisal. Also, a hat tip to the Bombay Wala Historical Works, who have introduced us to Professor Sassoon and through whom with whom we are jointly hosting this discussion today. Before I hand this over to Professor Sassoon, I have a little bit about me. I'm Dhwani Mehta, one of the co-founders of the Vidhi Center for Legal Policy. And perhaps more importantly, for the purpose of today's discussion, I'm a very proud Bombay Wada. I didn't know much about the Sassoon family before I read this book, apart from having visited the David Sassoon library at Kala Ghoda a few times and passed the Masina Hospital and Sassoon School for Boys in Baikala on my way to a music lesson. So I'm very grateful to have had the opportunity to read this book and to learn more about the city and the family that made it its home. So I'm going to hand it over now to you, Professor Sassoon, if you could take us through the presentation that you have prepared, and then we can go on to our conversation.
Thank you very much to all of you for hosting me. Let me just start with a little bit of just to share with you some slides. And just to put our conversations in context. So in the book, there are many personalities, but 5 are really the center of the book. The David Sassoon, the founder, on whose name, as was just mentioned, there is the Sassoon Library, and there is a beautiful statue at the entrance. His first son and oldest son, Abdullah, who becomes later on Sir Albert when he moves to London in 1872. His second son, Elias, who really opened China after the First Opium War, 1839, 1842, and he goes on behalf of the family to explore the possibilities and begins the trade of shipping opium from India and importing tea and silk from China. The fourth person is really fascinating, and I don't think she has ever been the focus of attention. Farha, who lived in Bombay and was the first global CEO at the end of the 19th century. She took over from her husband, who ran the business, Suleiman, in Bombay, and from 1895, more or less, to 1900, she ran the business. She ended up leaving as the men in the family were very unhappy about her success and kind of conspired against her. And the book has a whole chapter about her. Then there is the final figure, Victor Sassoon, who is a grandson of Elias, and who runs the business in the Far East. First, he starts from India in 1926, but takes all the business to Shanghai, where he invests in real estate. And it was tremendous success until the end of the 1937, when the Japanese invasion took place and heralded kind of the beginning of the end of that dynasty. When David died in 1864, the two eldest sons could not agree, and they split and created competing companies. The Abdullah one called David Sassoon and Co., the Elias one called Edie Sassoon. And they competed nonstop to the end, really. But Edie Sassoon, because of Victor, ended up staying longer. There are other personalities, of course, in the book. There is the famous World War I poet Siegfried Sassoon. There is the art collector and politician Philip Sassoon. And there are many others, but these are the main characters. As the family expanded, I wanted to show you how large this thing is, in the sense of, you could see very clearly that their expansion was in port cities mostly. There are 3 red stars, and you could see that these are the 3 main hubs: Bombay first, then Shanghai, and then London. All the others are all over port cities, really across the globe. This expansion was mostly through family members or employees, and I will come back to that in 1 second. This is their different houses and offices in Bombay. So the Sanssouci, which is the Messina Hospital, is their first house that David Sassoon purchased. And then he began the Garden Reach in Pune, as he was spending more and more of his time in Pune in the last 3-4 years of his life. And there he also built the Sassoon Hospital, which most people still call it Sassoon Hospital, although it's really today, I think, called General Hospital. And this is the offices in Rampart Row. So, the one important thing is David really felt home in Bombay. And one of his conditions in his will was that his house will not be sold for 51 years, just showing the commitment that he felt to Bombay and to the city, that basically not only provided him with wealth, but offered him a new life after being a refugee starting from nothing. This is the son Abdullah, who created the Sassoon docks. Again, that still exists today. As shipping began to expand dramatically in Bombay, there was a need for a new docks, and that gives you the idea, that in the 1870s, it was purchased, it was turned into a dock, and later in that decade was sold. This is the Sassoon Library in Mumbai, a stunning building in the heart of Bombay, and that's the statue that I was talking about. The statue was made in England and shipped, and still stands there in its beauty. Let me just finish with so when you remember when I showed you the map, how expansive they were, and they hired all those people. And of course, David Sassoon himself had a total of 14 children. and they spread all around the different ports. Now, the correspondence between every one of them was all in this language. This is a Baghdadi Jewish dialect written in Hebrew. So you need to know the Baghdadi dialect, you need to know Arabic very well, and you need to know Hebrew very well. And of course, you need to decode the writing. So it became almost a code language, which made it impossible for messengers to ever sell the information between one office to another, and gave them a huge edge in their spread. We can talk, there was also a little bit of negative in it, because as the business expanded dramatically, the pool of talent was limited, because everyone that you hire has to be fluent in writing and reading that language, which became a different issue. I'm going to stop sharing now and come back to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Sassoon. Always, I mean, that was a very useful overview of the main cast of characters. And there are many fascinating members of the family that I want to ask you more about. But I'll start at the very beginning, which is why is it that, I mean, the question that I want to ask is, why is it that David Sassoon chose Bombay to move to and to build a life there? And so maybe, you know, that first question is for you. And maybe the second part of that is for Faisal, if he'd like to take it, which is, what is it about Bombay that provided the sort of climate for a family like the Sassoons to flourish in and build such a prominent mercantile house?
Yeah, I mean, I actually really, when I was working in the archives, I was hoping to find something specific, because remember, there were a lot of, first of all, there were no borders. So it's all part of the Ottoman Empire. So a lot of Baghdadi merchant families and Baghdadi Jews moved from Baghdad to what is now Bahrain, Kuwait, all the Gulf, because there was a lot of trading opportunities there. Obviously, once he got to Iran, which is in Bushehr, he started meeting more and more traders and sailors who worked on behalf of the East India Company, and hearing about it. He also met a British representative in Baghdad, kind of the equivalent of a consul today, who worked in Bombay and was telling him about the city. And I think at the end of the day, what it triggered it, you have to think about it in the terms of 1829, 1830, to take your family with 2 young children and sail to totally unknown city with no relatives. You have no clue. I mean, it's not like today you can do some research, nothing, and arrive to a place like that. But what really, I think, attracted him is the notion that he kept hearing: Bombay, people in Bombay don't care about religion or sect or nationality. And it was a true statement, because he arrives and he sees a small city, barely to 100,000, but in a way very cosmopolitan. There was obviously the Hindus, the Muslims, the Parsis, the Christians, the Jews, the old Jews. And I think it really proved his instinct on this issue. Very correct. The other thing, which I might, just before passing it to Faisal, in the 130, 140 years of archives, there was not once a question, should we deal with A or B because of his religion or nationality or anything? And it really appealed to me, this open borders and globalization, real globalization. It was always, should we do business with A or B? Can we trust the person? And so trust, rather than the nationality or the religion was the important criteria for them throughout the whole period.
Thanks. Faisal, could I ask?
Yes. No, thanks very much, Joseph and Dwani. Just picking up from this last comment, it strikes me that Bombay was at the time very much like other important colonial ports that, in a sense, had no hinterland or had very little hinterland. Hong Kong, and many of them tended to be islands, like Bombay itself at one point. Hong Kong, Aden, Singapore, not all of them are islands, obviously, but they're islanded, even if they're not, geographically islands, in which you don't have much in the way of local political authority. These are new places created entirely by colonial capital, in which capitalism has a kind of space to operate freely and to create its own kind of utopia. And Bombay, like all of these other places, is therefore a site where you have an incredible concentration of different communities, ethnic, religious, linguistic. But it also serves as a site of exile for others. So when you think about, to some degree, David Sassoon himself as a kind of exilic figure, but also religious exiles and political exiles, two leaders from the branch of the Shiite community, both the Sayyidina and the Aga Khan, come respectively from Yemen and from Iran to Bombay. So it's connected to the whole world, and yet it's governed by capital rather than royalty, rather than by any kind of traditional form of polity. And in a way, that's what makes it the kind of place it is. But I also wanted to segue from that to ask Joseph about precisely minorities and people who are mobile and don't belong to any one place, because it strikes me that, like the Sassoons, and indeed like Jewish or Muslim or Hindu or whatever merchants of the period who were very successful precisely because they were unattached and mobile, what difference India might have made. When you think about Jewish merchants and capital in Europe, you often think about the fact that they were proscribed from engaging in other forms of, say, land ownership, etc. And so you have a kind of push into merchant and eventually industrial capital. This is not the case in India. And I wonder how you might compare the sort of the figure of the minority merchant, if you will, in Europe, as opposed to that same kind of person or community in a place like Bombay, since the family moves between both these places.
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting point, but actually, the Sassoons were very rooted and very connected to Baghdad. We're talking about something like could be 2,000, 2,500 years. The father of David Sassoon was basically the second most important personality in the province of Baghdad after the governor, because he was the equivalent of the finance minister and the tax collector. That decree has to come directly from the Sultan in Constantinople, which tells you that even back in the 18th century, that connection was started, and he was there for a very long time as the Minister of Finance. The family was very, very rooted in Baghdad, and that is to me, the extra dimension. Unlike, let's say, European families, which kept going on, Baghdad was their city. Remember also that if you look at the statistics from the 1820s, the Jews of Baghdad constituted probably 12% of the overall population. And they lived. I mean, you know, I got very upset when one review talked about a pogrom leading. There was absolutely no pogrom. They left because of a corrupt governor. And the fact is that all his siblings stayed behind, and I'm the descendant of one of those siblings. So the connection to Baghdad, and yet the ability to transfer and set up totally a new life and connect to it, actually, you know, is more impressive than a family that kept in every 2 generations to move around.
Absolutely. And actually, this is the sort of running theme through the book, Professor Sassoon, and you know, how there's this sort of constant, I won't call it conflict, but there's, you know, the Sassoons seem to tread the line between staying rooted to their origins and adapting to their new, new homeland, well, not homeland, but new places of residence very well. And, you know, partly their ability to feel at home everywhere is one of the reasons initially for the success of their business. But as you described later on in the book, perhaps later generations of the Sassoons lost those stronger ties with Baghdad. And I was wondering whether you could sort of explain or take us through why you think that might have happened. So what caused this sort of dilution or erosion of their original identity? And what is it in particular about England that perhaps made these ties more fragile? Because again, as you described, the later generations became more anglicized, were keen on being seen as part of the English aristocracy and become part of the elite there. So what do you think prompted this kind of dilution of identity, if you will?
Yeah, no, I mean, this is a really excellent question in the sense that they definitely settled in Bombay, and it starts with sending one son in the mid-1850s to London to really work, no different from sending someone to Hong Kong or Burma or wherever. But there becomes the process of Anglicization, you know. And of course, they're all reading the letters that he is sending every day as dictated by the father, and, you know, how wonderful London and what possibilities. And he's managing to, you know, make connections to senior British officials who worked and served in India and then gone back to London. And suddenly we see a second brother heading there and then a third brother there. And that is really the turning point. So all three are beginning to be talking about it. I think that as Abdullah sitting in London, it's almost, you feel a tinge of jealousy, you know. Why am I here when you're having fun? And they beginning to write him. They went to Bruges in Belgium and how beautiful and peaceful it was. And the second one says, well, we took the train and we went to this and that. And it's almost feeling like, well, if you're doing it, maybe I come also. And I think that's beginning the shift. But there was something to be absolutely fair from a business point of view. And that is that London was becoming more and more important as the capital of finance. That he started feeling, okay, we have these two hubs in Bombay and in Shanghai, but we really don't have a proper operation in London, you know, just one brother or two sending some letters. We need a more stable business. I will go and see how it is. But then he goes, and then it's almost like process that is unstoppable, because before he leaves, he already is knighted. So he changes his name from Abdullah to Albert and became known as Sir Albert. He arrives in London, and within few months, he is given a very, very prestigious award where no Indian or no Jew was ever given, and that's basically the freedom of the city of London. That's like the Guildhall of the most important capitalist system in the world. And I think it gets to some people, and it gets to them, seeing all these 300 people and members of parliament and dignitaries sitting there. And the relationship with the royalty is really very important to understand that process. They met the Prince of Wales back in Bombay on his visit, but they pick it up, the brothers and Abdullah, when they arrive to London, and the relationship just strengthens. And so the more you're in that circle, the more you're driven slowly but surely into that web. And then Anglicization becomes so critical and important to them. And remember, some of them beginning to intermarry with European families. So they are seeing themselves as part of the British and European aristocracy, and all kind of symbols are coming. And then the children that were growing in London were really losing the connection to India and to the Baghdad.
That's right. Yeah, it's very interesting how, one decision like Sir Abdullah's to move to London can set in motion a chain of events that perhaps really transformed the fortunes of the dynasty. But, as you said right now, Professor Sassoon, perhaps it was initially a business decision to make London a base as well for the family. But what seems to happen is that the family kind of loses its business acumen, its financial sense in London, and focuses more on being a part of high society or, general social mingling. So what is it that kind of explained this sort of not disenchantment perhaps, but indifference to the business and the trading, core of the family that David and Abdullah and Elias personified?
Yeah, I mean, there are very good research done on the culture of the upper class and the business. If you were part of the aristocracy, you're not supposed to work. You are an aristocrat. Aristocrats do not work. And by the way, that continued throughout the 20th century for a very long time until it began to change. But even if you I quote in the book The Economist that saying a landed gentry should do this and that and not engage in work. And so if all your friends, none of them are working, and one is so desperate to be part of that group, well, you don't work. and you are just living the life of horse racing, shooting, hunting, estates in different places. That becomes essential. Now, Abdullah Albert managed to keep that balance because he was from the old guard, and so did his brother Elias. But the new people, because of the new personal situation, family situation, and all this, they started going to the extreme and saying, okay, if that's how the aristocracy behaves, we should behave like that.
That's right. And I mean, you can see in the book that even that the person who does invest more in the business and help it expand is Suleiman, who is based in Shanghai and then Bombay. And, his wife also carries on that tradition. So perhaps where you are located really does determine what your priorities are going to be, and you can see that quite clearly with the family. Faisal, do we see this trend of sort of Anglicization with other merchant houses in India at the time, other industrial families? I mean, I know, there were lots of them went abroad to study, spent a few years there, but it seems as if at least to my knowledge, this kind of transformation of a family from, one that's based in a particular city, rooted in a particular culture, towards England didn't happen with, I suppose, the native families in India. So do we see any trends like that, or, do the ties and connections with Bombay remain strong throughout the 20th and 21st century?
Well, what you do see to some degree, of course, among Parsis. And right. In this sense, what I was saying earlier about the lack of a hinterland. Yeah. And, that's true as much for the making of Bombay as a utopia of capitalism as it is for some of these commercial groups. So if you are Parsi or, say, Jewish, you're being reconstructed into a group which doesn't have a demographic or much of a social hinterland, and therefore is free to transform itself. So, Zoroastrians in Iran are quite a different matter, and, perhaps Jews in Baghdad, but cut off from, at least relatively cut off from that particular sense of not rootedness so much as obligation to a set of other, people of other professions and other classes who might also be part of your community. You're free to transform yourself. So the very thing that allows them to remake themselves and become such successful capitalists might, as in Joseph's narrative, end up in the end doing them down. That they become, if you will, too westernized. But I also wonder, because, David Sassoon comes to India at a time, the Napoleonic Wars are done. The Congress of Vienna has, remade the international order. Britain is finally the paramount power in Europe. So it's an era of great stability and of British dominance, but also one that is counter-revolutionary. So you go back to the monarchies of Europe, even though, of course, they increasingly modernize in capitalist terms. So in a way, it doesn't surprise me that here you have the Sassoons, at least those who moved to England, who are simultaneously coming out of, if you will, hyper-modern forms of capitalism that allow them to straddle the globe. But on the other hand, once they are in Europe, seem to fall under the lure or the seduction of the sort of counter-revolutionary model of political and social elites, aristocracies, monarchies, and all the rest. That sort of happens with some Indian communities, but not to this extent. And if it does happen, it happens later. But, with Parsis, you also see the ability to change dress codes, dietary codes, inheritance codes to some degree, who you can eat with, whom you can marry. All of these things are much more difficult for other Indian merchant groups because they are tied back to other kinds of demographic and social hinterlands.
No, that's very insightful, Faisal. I was just wondering, Professor Sassoon, I think to pick up on something that Faisal mentioned is, he said that the way in which, inheritance worked in some of these families, could also sometimes act as a barrier to their fortunes later on. And you talked in the book quite extensively about the lack of long-term planning that that marked perhaps the decline in fortunes of the Sassoons. So they hadn't planned for long-term trusts. They didn't know how to do tax planning to avoid some of the prohibitive death duties on their estates. So for what seems to be such a prudent business house, and for families which seem to have such an eye on the ball as far as the bottom line is concerned, what explains this sort of lack of foresight as far as estate planning and thinking about how their wealth would pass on to future generations goes?
Yeah, I mean, I struggled with this point a lot because one of the things that I kept wondering when I am going and reading his will for the first time, this will is uncovered, is in the archives. Well, believe it or not, the will was written 2 years before the founder, David Sassoon's death. Now, what is very clear to me, given the shock of the second son, that there was never a discussion. That there was never a discussion between the father and the two sons saying, I'm going to appoint my oldest son because of tradition or because A and B. None. I don't know whether the oldest son even knew about it. And he was working with him in Bombay in the same office, maybe in the same room. The second son, of course, was all over China and had no clue about it. So you imagine the shock. And I think it's almost that a tradition, you're not supposed, that's kind of where a little bit of the background, of scared to talk about what it is after death, is very much of the tradition of, the evil eye or whatever it is. You don't start discussing death when you are alive. And it's a very, very difficult subject, but I actually think that the beginning of the decline is in that will, because families have splits and businesses have splits, but not, think about it. He arrives in 1832, he settles. The first 20 years, he's not that important until the 1850. He dies in 1860. It's barely 2 decades of successful business. It takes its toll on both brothers, on the business, because now you're spending a lot of your energy competing and proving to each brother, I will show you. And it continues on. Abdullah also was very feeble, with feeble health in the last year and a half. And again, there is nothing of the real discussion. My eldest son will, and here you could see that the tradition was really more important than, the modern way of thinking, of planning, which, let's say, what the Rothschilds have done in creating trust to protect. And of course, it got exacerbated by the fact that there are so many members of the family. So it's very easy, mathematically, to explain where does a huge wealth like this dissolve? Well, if one has 5 children and none of the 5 is really working to buy the assets, it's splitting under 5. And then because they were in Britain, the death taxes or the estate due taxes are very high, and so they lost not only the business, but they lost all these gems of real estate properties that they bought in the heart of London, which, they became 100 times more, Belgravia, Knightsbridge, all Hyde Park, top places. And so they lost that asset as time went by. And so you could just see from one generation to another what it was doing, this lack of planning.
That's right. And, this is one of the problems with, one of the issues that explains the sort of dissipation of wealth. But the other, as you've again talked about in your book, is their failure to diversify and sort of cotton on to the fact that, well, opium and cotton were not going the way that, that they should, and that it was time not to sort of bet all their money on or invest heavily in the two traditional commodities in which they'd been trading and look for other avenues. So, Faisal, if I could ask you, as in, what is it that, how did other, because obviously, there were other merchant houses in Bombay were also heavily dependent on trade in opium and cotton. Did they see the writing on the wall earlier? Were they just more adept at being able to diversify? What is it that explains why, some of the fortunes of these families sort of continue to this day? But, it was something that the Sassoons failed to sort of see and act on.
Yeah, it's interesting. Some, of course, are successful, like the Tatas, who do also start out in opium and, move. But they do something quite remarkable because they end up in big industry. And that means a different kind of rootedness. And eventually a kind of, if you will, investment in the future nation state that is coming to be. But if you are actually spread all over the world, you don't necessarily, whatever your political allegiances, you don't have that particular kind of investment. And also the desire to have liquidity or to invest your wealth in things like Joseph has been telling us about, properties, which can also appreciate, depreciate, be sold, and all the rest. So, you can't physically lift properties, but you can dispose of them. So I think, the real difference is perhaps between that kind of mercantile capital and connected to commodities and trade in larger and larger arenas of circulation, and the new kind of industrial capitalism that is grounded in another fashion altogether, and that has not yet become transnational. They might have bits and pieces here and there. The Tatas will also have representatives in London, but they're not of the same kind. I just wonder, whether that gets to be a distinction. And what I find interesting is that much of the earlier wealth is in trade in commodities, and it's that kind of wealth that doesn't really sustain itself for many different reasons. The world changes, economies change, new competitors come on board, etc. But in that kind of magical period, from the in the middle to late 19th century and into the early 20th, before the First World War, they are still very, very important. And you can imagine them thinking to themselves, why should we do anything more than this? The world just keeps opening up to us.
Yeah, and I suppose also, the mobility afforded at that time. So Victor sort of decided that it was time to move from India to China, and he could sort of, wholesale shift. I mean, in a perhaps not a very well thought out decision, move everything he had to China and then suffer losses there. But I suppose it's a function both of the fact that it was easy to move capital around like that, as well as the fact that, the Sassoons really were truly global and perhaps didn't have the kind of mooring that other families had to a particular place, at least in the later generations.
I mean, the comparison with the Tatas is really the most striking, because they were, one thing interesting about life also in Bombay in the 1850s, 60s, 70s is how close all those families. So the Sassoon set up a mill, and guess what? All the board members are the same 4 or 5 families. The Tatas set a board, and there's the Sassoons, and they're all on the same board of the banks. But I think that is really where the Anglicization begins to cripple the thinking. You could see by the end of the 1870s, Tata is basically telling them, look, this opium, cotton is great business now, but it's not going to last. There is something going on called the Industrial Revolution. Let's get on that wave. And, going back to what Faisal was saying, they were comfortable. Why should we? Why should we start something new when money is good, life is good, and we don't have to take much risk? And we know the business now really, really well of cotton mills, opium. We can deal with everything. And they really did not understand why Tata is interested. I mean, there is this, in the book, I bring this striking comparison that while they were all still debating opium and things, one of the Tatas goes to the United States and spends 4 months learning about the steel business. Can't have a more contrast than that. Someone is already thinking about 50 years of the future. These guys are stuck in the past, and which is the exact opposite of how they succeeded in the 1830s, 1840s, 50s, of being able to anticipate quickly the shipping changing. Yes, let's adopt docks. Yes, let's buy docks. And you're right, Faisal, also about the real estate. I mean, and you mentioned that. In a way, the move from Bombay to Shanghai was brilliant. He takes with him, by the way, 80 million US dollars in 1926 value. You can imagine what it is now. It triples in 12 years because real estate in Shanghai is skyrocketing. Well, he didn't put into the equation first a Japanese invasion and then a World War II. And once he could have tripled his wealth and the family wealth had he sold in 1936 and gone back to India or somewhere else, but he didn't. And I think that decision, he has that wonderful quote when the communists nationalized everything in 1949, and he's sitting in New York, and someone knocks on the door, and he says, everything is gone, and he says, well, I gave up India, and China gave me up, which sums up everything. I lost both, right?
Could the one person who might have changed their fortunes been Flora? Was she the one who, I mean, she was the one who wanted to professionalize, who brought in a great degree of innovation into the way in which the business was run. What do you think what course would the family have taken had she been allowed to continue to be in charge?
I think she is really, really an incredible personality. I gave a talk a year ago at one of the Harvard Business School about her management style. And it is really remarkable. It's almost like, a consultancy these days tell you how she streamlined everything, decision-making, exposure to foreign exchange, where no one knew what is the end of the day, the total of the exposure to foreign exchange. We know him, we know this agent, do whatever. She put it all in line. How things have to be reported, how daily reports have to come from mills and offices in Manchester and Liverpool because it will affect. And I think the more she wanted to take them to the 20th century and modernize them, the more the men got angrier and more frustrated and kept going back to that. How can a widow with 3 children run a global business? They never said, oh, wow, look at her. She's a widow with 3 children, yet she is phenomenally successful and gaining more respect everywhere. The exact opposite happened. And yes, I mean, I think the David Sassoon and Co., that's the firm of Abdullah, I think that was really the beginning of the end of that family side by pushing her out, because no other important personality came in. No one understood the business and no one understood the risk. She also, her hands were tied. I mean, actually, you can wonder whether she would have started thinking in 1895, because there was already the commission of inquiry about opium, and the signs were there. You know, the writing was on the wall that this is going to come to an end sooner or later. Whether, had she been given the freedom, whether she would have shifted. But she, you know, as any person in corporate world can tell you, you know, when you spend a third or more of your time dealing with internal conspiracies of your brothers and nephews and things, it takes its toll.
Yeah, I mean, it's remarkable. You know, I hope there's maybe another book that you want to write just about her, because I'd love to read more. And it's a shame that she was ousted in the way she was. But
yes,
would you say that this was, I mean, it was already very progressive that someone like her was at the helm of, the business of such a large enterprise? Do we have examples of this from other families like this in Bombay at the time? Do we know of any prominent women who might have, you know, been the Sethanis of that time?
I don't know whether Faisal, you know, I have not come across. I mean, I think the mercantile community in Bombay reacted very strongly when her husband was alive and she announced that she wants to come to the office every week for 3 days a week. And basically, she sat in the corner of his office listening to all the negotiations and the deals being made, and realized how unregulated the decision making. It was all about gut feeling and contact. But they adopted to it. And of course, once she became the boss, they really didn't have, the agents, the other merchants didn't have a choice about it. I think also the family didn't have a choice, because none of them wanted to go back to India or China and run the business. And Abdullah by then was relatively old, and definitely had no intentions of going back. So their agreeing to her being the CEO was not as a sign of being a progressive family, as much as, well, we really don't have choices, and we realize she's the only one who knows the business.
Right. Thanks for sort of, putting it in that perspective, Professor Sassoon. I mean, related to that, I'm going to move to some of the audience questions now. So related to the question of the power that women in the Sassoon family exercised, someone asks, how real was the soft power that the female Sassoons had by virtue of legal control over their dowries?
So it's very interesting, the dowries. A lot of times, given the fact that both sides of the family are well off, I found a new thing that I really didn't know, that the Sassoon would give a dowry for one of their daughters, but in an interesting way, it stays in her account, almost a trust on behalf of the daughter or the sister. I have not come across this before. And obviously, it provides a lot of protection to these daughters at the time. But there was definitely the usual negotiations about the dowries. It's very interesting also about the dowries. Never, ever comes up to discussion when they are intermarrying the Rothschild or the Gunzbergs or the Polyakov, because kind of it's not accepted. And there you're really marrying for the name and the connection, rather than, you know, to establish the business aspect of it.
Right. Thanks, Professor Sassoon. Now we have a question from someone who's obviously read the book in very great detail. I think this is for you, Professor Sassoon. The question is, what was the duration of the success of E.D. Sassoon? Sorry. Was the duration of the success of E.D. Sassoon largely due to its amalgamation with Arnhold?
It definitely played a role in China because Arnhold had really a lot of operation in places and cities that the Sassoons did not have access. And suddenly China is becoming more open for them. They also, Arnhold knew the business much better than the Sassoon because they were in so many diverse places. And yes, I think that was a very good move for the Sassoon. But E.D. Sassoon, remember Elias, the founder of E.D. Sassoon, lived a lot of his time in China. So did his son Jacob. And so that kind of tradition of connection more to China and Shanghai in particular was in a way much stronger than for the David Sassoon and co.
Right. Thanks, Professor Sassoon. One last question from the audience before I pose a final round of questions to the both of you. Colin Benjamin asks, what was the relation between the Sassoon family and the Indian political elite? So Gandhi, Nehru, Tilak, because you do write in your book a lot about the way their relations with the British, but what was it like with the Indian political elite?
So it's really interesting. I think that in the beginning, they, especially Victor, ignores it. Then when he comes back in 1937, he wants suddenly to revive it and to meet every important personality in the Indian nationalist movement. But it's a little bit late by 1937 because things have already been kind of set in motion. One member of the family is involved in Indian nationalism. That is the daughter of Farha, who lives in Calcutta and marries someone from Calcutta. And actually, they stay in India. And they were major supporters of the Indian nationalist movement. I think they stayed almost until the late 1950s or even later in Calcutta.
Right. I think my favorite anecdote from the book is when you talk about how Sir David Ezra, who I think was the son-in-law of Farha, was refused membership to the Bengal Club. And it turned out that he owned the land on which the club was situated.
Yes.
By far my most favorite anecdote of the book. I'm going to ask a last set of questions to both you, Faisal and Professor Sassoon. So Faisal, you first. How welcoming do you think Bombay would be today to a family like the Sassoons?
That's a very interesting question. It's difficult to say because we don't seem to see such families any longer. It seems, it's a city that is welcoming to other kinds of corporate players who are not family businesses, which are not family businesses. And that actually gets to another issue, which is one of great importance and about which I've already spoken with Joseph during his talk in Oxford. What happens to the family firm, both in India and internationally? The Tatas and a couple of the other Parsi firms are the only ones that really seem to transition out of family business into a kind of publicly traded one. And if you don't do that, the likelihood of declining or even shutting down within 3-4 generations is apparently quite high. And it's true for Indian businesses to this day. And yet, this is not a unilinear movement because we see today globally, including in the US, the return of private companies as opposed to publicly traded ones. And so, something quite interesting is going on here. I don't know if it's a cyclical movement or what, but certainly what happens with the family firm is a big, big consideration. And India still is dominated by those firms. So the groups that are welcomed tend to be corporatized public body, institutions, not families. And so they're headed by CEOs who change and who can be easily disposed of. And I think that's the big difference, while India itself remains a kind of family-friendly capitalist environment.
What about the observation that Professor Sassoon made right at the beginning, the sort of the freedom of fear about discrimination on the grounds of race or caste or religion? That's the atmosphere that allowed the Sassoons to flourish. Do you think Bombay is the same kind of city today as well?
I'm not sure. It has taken several hits, as you know. That reputation has taken several hits, not least, well, from very early on, when linguistic states were devised in the 1950s. That was one of the big arguments about Bombay. Nehru initially wanted Bombay to remain a kind of free city and not be part either of Gujarat or of Maharashtra, because he thought this would destroy not just the cosmopolitanism of the place, but the place as a heartland of Indian finance and capital, which required diversity of all kinds. As we know, that didn't happen, and Bombay became part of Maharashtra, while yet retaining a hugely significant Gujarati capitalist class, more significant than the Maharashtrian one, much more. And so there still was a bit of diversity there, though differently configured. But since that period, of course, and perhaps beginning, with the riots from the early 1990s, even that reputation has been steadily whittled down. What remains, of course, is the fact that the city continues to be incredibly diverse, both in terms of its business communities and in general. And, that is, if you will, its saving grace in every sense.
Absolutely. And we have someone from, this isn't a question really, but it's a comment that's sort of celebrating the diversity that the Sassoons brought to India. So Subhash Kale talks about how he studied and worked in the Sassoon Hospital and the associated BJ Medical College for nearly 50 years. And he's very proud of the Sassoon name. So that must be a very nice comment for you to read, Professor Sassoon.
Thank you.
And that brings me to my closing question to you, Professor Sassoon. And this is a more personal one, I suppose. What has this project of tracing your family's history meant to you? What have you learned through this experience, and how has it, do you see any similarities with your own experience emigrating from your homeland?
Thank you. First of all, it was an amazing excursion where I learned a lot. I learned a lot about Indian history. I learned about Chinese history. I learned about opium quite a lot. After all, I am my area of expertise is really the modern Middle East. So this was all new to me. Traveling to all the places in India and in China was absolutely thrilling. Doing all the works in so many different archives was enriching. Although I am not a descendant, I really never felt emotionally involved while writing the book. There was something in my head, obviously, that, getting up and dropping everything and leaving, because my family also escaped in the 1970s, and I talk about it in the book, from Baghdad without anything, and starting as an immigrant, a refugee without anything. There was a lot that spoke to me. And if anything, this book really, really emphasized the determination and the contribution of so many immigrant and refugees families worldwide, that we really don't give it enough attention and enough credit in what they have produced and what have contributed to their new homes and new economies. And may it continue.
Thank you, Professor Sassoon. For me, the last line of your book really resonates with me, where you talk about how this experience has taught you the experience of learning about your family and their fortunes has taught you not to take anything for granted. And that's something I'm taking away with me as well. So the cosmopolitanism and vibrancy of the city, Bombay, that I grew up in, that's also something that I feel is important for us not to take for granted, and that it's something that doesn't just happen, it's something that we have to strive to preserve. And I hope that, the city goes back to being the kind of thriving cosmopolitan hub that it once was at the time at which your family first came there. Thanks very much, everyone, for such a wonderful discussion. Thanks, Faisal. Thanks to the sign language interpreters as well for helping us along during this event. And thank you to our audience. And especially thank you so much, Professor Sassoon, for writing this marvelous book, weaving together these many worlds and taking us on this wonderful historical journey. It's been a real pleasure having you speak to us today. And I hope we can have you back for more discussions in the future, because I feel there are several more books in here still waiting to be written and discussed. So thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you very much. And I really do hope that the next talk will be in Mumbai itself.
We would love